What's up, everybody? Before we get into today's show, I've got another ad for you, and it is from Nuclear Now. Listen to this. Legendary Academy Award winning director Oliver Stone is back with Nuclear Now, his first film in 7 years, coming exclusively to theaters across the USA and Canada beginning on April 28th. That's the end of this month. Based on the book A Bright Future, written by award-winning scholar of international relations, Professor Joshua S. Goldstein, who also co-wrote the film. Nuclear Now explores the possibility for the global community to overcome the challenges of climate change and energy poverty to reach a brighter future through the power of nuclear energy, an option that may become the only viable way to ensure our continued survival sooner than we think. With unprecedented access to the nuclear industry in France, Russia, and the United States, director Oliver Stone delivers a revolutionary documentary that Variety has called an intensely compelling must-see film. It opens in New York and Los Angeles on April 28th with a special one-day screening events across North America on Nuclear Now Day, May 1st, that you don't want to miss. Visit nuclearnowfilm.com to learn more. And by the way, you can find that website hyperlinked in the show notes. Now, on with the show. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Nuclear Barbarians. It is I, your nuclear barbarian, Emmett Penny, and I am here with the sunniest dude I know, Grant Dever, the king of eternal optimism. What is up, my guy? How you doing?
What's up? I'm doing great. It's great to be here, Emmett. Thank you so much for inviting me. We've been trying to make this happen for a minute, and I'm so glad to
Yeah.
be here.
No, I'm glad we finally put the time aside to make it happen. So I want to talk to you about something you wrote for the Free Op blog about nuclear in Texas. Before we get into that, before we get to the Lone Star State splitting more atoms, let me
Yeah.
ask you a little bit about yourself. So I know a little bit about you from our time hanging out in Indie Thinkers together during the pandemic when everybody was living indoors. But like, what's your
Mhm.
story? How did you, everybody has a story for how they get to nuclear because it's not like supporting renewables or whatever, where you're just like, yeah, you just do. So tell me that story.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I've growing up, I was definitely a bit of just an environmentalist in general, and I think it kind of happened in a very benign way. I was in New York State public schools, so there's definitely a lot of talk about climate. An
Hmm.
inconvenient truth was a big thing. I'm pretty sure we watched it in class at some point. I joined the Green Team when I got into high school, and me and my friends
Sick.
basically ran that organization. Yeah, it was fun, but that was all great stuff. I mean, definitely spent a lot of time recycling things in ways that were probably not good for the environment.
Sure,
But
sure. Yeah.
we did feel like stewards. The things that we did that were really great was we would go and clean up different parks around. We'd spend
Oh,
like morning on a
that's
Saturday
important.
going and picking up stuff. Yeah, no, that was great. And it was a lot of fun. I definitely recommend people get involved with those kinds of things just because, it feels good. Like you get outside, you're hanging with people, you're at the margin doing something very tangible and visceral to,
Hmm.
be a good steward of the environment. So anyway, I was in the green team, definitely didn't know anything about economics, didn't know anything really about sustainability. At that point,
Hmm.
a lot of this technology wasn't really scaling. It was more like this is clearly the solution, and fossil fuels are bad, and all this kind of thing,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
wasn't really deep into it. Kind of continued that when I attended the University of Rochester. There I studied economics and business. Graduated with a business degree because I wanted to go study abroad in Vienna, Austria. Totally worth it. Definitely the right choice. But when I was there, I became an eco rep, which was
Hmm.
also a great decision because basically it was like a freshman on every single freshman hall was in charge of being like the sustainability advocate.
Mm.
And there I dove deeper into some of these issues, still didn't get the economics piece. It's very much just like high modernist, like here's the obvious solution. We figured it out. Like this is
Mm.
evil. This is good. Let's go. But I don't know. I don't feel like I learned a whole lot from that. And then to getting to nuclear specifically, I think it was a bit on my radar. I was hearing some unconventional arguments from this one professor, Professor Rizzo. I didn't take the environmental economics course. Huge mistake. Should have done that. But from my friends who were in the class who were being challenged in these different ways,
Hmm.
we were just nerds, so we'd talk about he was like, what's the opportunity cost for this?
Sure,
He was
yeah.
very critical of recycling in particular and whether or not that made sense and was even good for the environment, particularly in New York, where we were definitely subsidizing that activity very heavily.
Oh yeah.
But that kind of got me interested. And then I think I really started to look um, at nuclear during Andrew Yang's run for president because he
Dude, he got
like people
so many
obviously
people into it. He got so many
yeah.
people turned on. I don't think we talk enough about how the Yang Gang got hardcore nuke pilled.
Yeah, they did. They did. And it was like this thing. Like, I mean, his campaign, I definitely have a lot of like criticisms of where it went.
Sure.
I was definitely defending him against people being like, these are bad arguments. And I was like, no, but his book is actually really good. Like, I think the way that they
Yeah.
tried to portray themselves in media, and like popular media and like the quips and all that was actually much inferior to like the rigor of his thought, both in his book and the extensive policy platform that he had. So he was a big thorium reactor guy. I was like, oh, I haven't even
Mhm.
really considered nuclear at this point. I don't know anything about the grid, to the extent that I know anything about the grid now, which is like,
Sure, yeah.
still like
Yeah. No, dude, I'm there with
a
you. I learn more every day. And
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. But at the time, I looked into that, and then, I definitely um I've learned so much, and I'd say definitely since COVID, a lot of that attributed to connecting to you and just we're this thing indiethinkers.org we referred to earlier, and it was essentially a group of people online during COVID who are interested in ideas and writing about them, trying to build audiences. We connected over these work sessions, and I wasn't particularly following anything related to energy other than your work, just because we were on Twitter and you'd publish things and I'd read them. So you brought me along. And then this all really accelerated when I moved to Austin, and you and Mark and Paris hit me up. And, at the time, all these, activists in different countries and states are petitioning to shut down active nuclear plants. No one was trying to do that in Texas, but with Stand Up for Nuclear, you guys are trying to organize people to have someone there to defend, and an email list and people who care about nuclear, and get it on the ground. And you guys reached out to me because I was your guy in Texas. I just moved here a week or two before,
Dude, I
didn't
remember
really
that.
know
I remember
anyone.
you were just like, yeah, I mean, I go to these hangouts in Austin, so I can talk to people. And I was like, great, good enough.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good enough. I was like, maybe I'll talk to students and get them involved. I know one guy who's like a big Nixon head, and because of that, he's like pro nuclear. Like I can get some people together. But I ended up um oh, I guess the other thing that got me into energy, which it was like I got into energy and I got into nuclear kind of at the same time, and then
Mhm.
have continued learning more and more, was Bitcoin. During 2020, I very much
Totally.
fell down the Bitcoin rabbit hole and just learning as much as of that about that as I could. And obviously, there's a lot of environmental FUD against Bitcoin. And there
Mhm.
were these people like Nick Carter and some of these other people who I found particularly interesting and engaging, talking about how those were not really good arguments. They were more a reflection of like, our inability to expand the energy supply and like this
Yep.
overregulation, both at like permitting, NRC, all of this. So I was like, oh, I did move to Texas. A lot of people here obviously care about energy. And then these
Yeah,
Bitcoin people really care about energy. And I'm going to meetups with them all the time. So I reached out to some people in there, started posting this Telegram. The event I ended up getting like 20 to 30 people to come to a couple meetups to talk about this. I really did not know anything at that time about transmission or any of
sure.
this stuff. I
Yeah.
said some
Yeah. All
silly
the
things,
specifics. You're just riding on
Yeah.
vibes.
I was just raw vibes, just being like, this is good. And just it shouldn't be illegal, like let's let these things compete. Let's create
Sure.
a regulatory environment, and where it makes sense, it makes sense. Where it doesn't, like I'm open to it not being the solution for everything everywhere. But
Hmm.
my position is has stayed, like I'm in favor, and it's very good. But from that, the president of FreeOp, Ovik Roy, reached out to me because he's spoken at Bitcoin Miami. He's definitely a Bitcoin guy. He has a think tank, the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, and he was like, you're interested in nuclear power, you're interested in Bitcoin. I looked at your Substack and you can write. You should come work for us. So it's been a
Awesome.
part-time gig, but yeah, it all started because I decided to do some work for free. Crazy. This is actually not an uncommon story. For those of
Hmm.
you who haven't had to grind your way into some work opportunity before. This is generally how things work, at least good things. um
Yeah, for sure.
and yeah, so then over the last like a bit over a year, like last 14 months, I've been digging in deeper and continuing on that journey, and have published a couple long form articles, one research paper, and a bunch of blogs and tweets about the as part of the nuclear advocacy program.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I loved you. So I'll put this in the show notes too. I know we're going to talk about the Texas thing, but you did a great thing on Fukushima and safety and stuff like that. That was a well-researched, great article. I remember at one point I was just like, the student has surpassed the master, such that I could ever be one. Because you're just like, what about this thing with Fukushima? And I was just like, yeah, I have no idea. You're going to have to figure that out on your own, buddy. I do not know. So yeah, people can check that out in the show notes. I think I even cited it in one of my American Affairs pieces. But yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of like your story is a really cool one of how it's a very rare one, right? Like, so the episode before this, I was talking to Paris Ortiz Wines, mutual friend of ours, and we were talking about the pivot from doomerism to like nuclear hope. And we'll talk about this later in the episode, but that's usually the trajectory. You've always been like, let's go. Like, let's figure out the solution. Let's get mission oriented. Like that's my impression of you, that you're like, well, these things might be difficult or bad, but like we're doing it. And that's the vibe I got from your thing about Texas, where you're like, there is no reason Texas should not have way more nuclear plants. So
Yes.
let's talk about that piece. Like, I read that piece and I was like, coherent. I'm down. I mean, I'm down for nuclear pretty much any and everywhere, but like, why isn't this happening more in Texas? And obviously, there's a federal component and there's some other stuff going around. So why don't you just like walk me through the piece for the listeners? And by the way, again, everybody, in the show notes if you want to dig in.
Yeah, so I would essentially, the argument in the piece is that so the Texas legislature is in session, or about to start making moves again. That only happens every 2 years. And we've been kind of talking, I've been talking with people, especially since the invasion of Ukraine. It's very
Mm-hmm.
evident how important it is that we have natural gas, and like obviously it's a
Mm-hmm.
huge potential export. It's a huge industry, but also there's so much more that can be done as far as exports of liquefied natural gas to not
Sure.
only Germany and these other countries abroad, but even to New England, where they very much need natural gas to back up their current energy mix and make sure that the power stays on and they burn less diesel during
Yeah.
winter.
Yeah.
And I talked to some people offline, who are in oil and gas, and they're interested in nuclear. I'm like, I don't think anyone, or I'm sure there are some people who view it as some kind of like zero sum adversarial type thing. They
Mm-hmm.
like that nuclear is illegal, functionally. Obviously,
Yeah.
there are operational nuclear plants, but we're not building anywhere near as many of them as we could and should be.
Yeah.
And the kind of hook for that piece was the approval of the design for NuScale's
Yep.
SMR, or at least one of them. And hopefully there's more of that. Hopefully that there is some push. The kind of crazy thing is that I think in the Biden or in the Obama administration, in the Trump administration, in the Biden administration, there are lots of pro-nuclear people there, like as far as
Sure.
executives and people who are appointed. So it is this kind of weird thing where it's like, well, why isn't it happening? Why
Yeah.
can't we make this happen? Like we're all like if you read the tweets coming out of these offices, if you read the things that they're writing, like they don't sound too different. The tone is a bit different, but they don't sound too different from you and I. So
Hmm.
how can we get there? So what the goal with the piece was just pushing forward this narrative, like, hey, we got these designs approved. There's like, let's hope. I'm optimistic. Let's start printing these things out. Let's start building that nuclear baseload capacity. Let's bring it into Texas. I've already written about how I think having more nuclear would be really good for grid resiliency and all these issues that are hot
Hmm.
button political topics. And in that piece, I'm like, let's remove any excessive regulations that may exist within Texas to
Hmm.
onboarding these. Like, let's make sure once the NRC gets out of the way, one way or another, or we figure out some way to approve these new reactors and get them in, that Texas is ready. We're ready to ride up that curve. We're ready to increase our supply of low carbon baseload energy, and it's not this adversarial thing at all, because there is so much demand for Texas liquefied natural gas, and we're going to get those LNG terminals approved as well, and Texas is just going to be so positioned to thrive in our new energy
Hmm.
paradigm. That's kind of the pitch. um
Hmm.
so yeah, there's a lot of different work that
Yeah,
can
I
be done to try
mean
to make
that
that
sort of
real.
it sort of makes sense to me. Like one of the things, and I don't know a lot about this, but I've sort of had brief conversations with people in the energy industry, and I'm wondering just how harmonized the domestic market for natural gas will be in America with the international market, and if we're going to see more of that in the future, in which case it would be really beneficial for a grid awash in natural gas generators to start building a form of base load that's low carbon.
Yeah, and I think as far as this like pitch for Texas too, as being a place where it's like in Texas, you're sheltered from like this excessive regulation. We're
Mhm.
a place that's good for business. There's a lot of talk in many circles about onshoring, lots of
Mhm.
industry and different things. There's people, myself included, people have become acquainted with the idea of a supply chain, and that sometimes it's not just seamlessly working. There's a lot going on there, and the kind of quip I have, not related to taxes at all. I think this is the misnomer, but we're all, in some sense, we're all supply siders now. Like, we at least realize that if things don't get made, they become very expensive. Like
Yeah,
no one should
yeah.
really be disputing that. We all learned that the hard way. I don't think that, like, I know that I'm familiar with the arguments about how that has to do with tax policy and stuff, but it's mostly has to do with regulatory policy and whether or not you can build things and whether or not
Yeah.
that's legal. Of course, there are other considerations, but that's like the big
Yeah, it's not
bottleneck
monocausal, but you
here.
can't deny that that's like a huge aspect, right? Like no, like nobody's going to be like, yeah, NEPA isn't a problem,
Yeah,
right?
and
Like
and I
anybody
think
who wants to build anything substantial is like running into those issues.
and a piece that one of the proposed ideas I have a lot for things I could write for free op is making the case that this permitting reform is necessary, even if you are a total like renewables plus batteries maximalist. Like, if
Hmm.
you think that is what's necessary, like the only way you're going to be able to compete and not just throw everyone into energy poverty or worse is with permitting, with making these things easier to build, with reducing litigation costs and all these kinds of things. So there's actually some bills being proposed, or so there's
Hmm.
one bill, but then it's going to get split up into many in the House, being proposed by a bipartisan set of Congress
This is in the
people.
Texas House, right? Not the.
No,
Oh,
in
no,
the
okay.
yeah, in the federal government. So it's like the Lower Cost of Energy Act, I believe, is how it's being
Oh,
framed.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
Hmm.
it's
That's
essentially
like
a big
HR
permitting
one, right?
reform. Yeah,
Like,
HR
yeah,
one. Yeah.
that's right. Okay.
So yeah, so essentially, the Republicans got all their people on board with a series of reforms that they want to see. And there are definitely people among the Democrats who are interested in these as well. I think a lot of these ideas were the kinds of things that Joe Manchin was essentially promised would pass after the
Hmm.
IRA. He said some things about he doesn't want the big bill, he wants the piecemeal, but right now, it's going to be some politics. We're in for some politics before some policy, but I think a lot of the ideas are very good. And anyway, I kind of want to make that case that even if you want to see a very different transformation, we need this regulatory reform. And there's definitely some good,
Hmm.
liberals like myself and people who identify as progressives who are in favor of these kind of reforms as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting tension I've been observing sort of play out with the Biden administration, whether it's like the oil stuff in Alaska or the stuff with the right whales off the East Coast, like the collision between the climate oriented environmental side and then like the conservation environmental side. And there seems to be like it seems to be as if like nobody really thought there were conflicts there until they've arrived, and that's all. Like permitting reform is all tied up in that, right? Like that's like these groups like the big four: Sierra Club, NRDC, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, or whatever. Like they all push for all renewables all the time, and then at the chapter level like fight tooth and nail to stop it. It
Yeah.
is fascinating to watch. Like I don't know what you think about that as somebody who has come up through sort of environmental stuff. You've always had that concern. You've been consistent about that your whole time. Like, how do you think about this dance, this balance between these things?
Yeah, I think, so it's hard for me to know what I think really the ideal policy is for some of this. A lot of the proposed reforms are essentially like FERC should be in charge, and FERC should be the one that has like the final authority in a lot of these
Mm-hmm.
questions. Just streamlining, you know, the amount of, the amount of reports that need to be produced, and like
Sure. Yeah.
how many times people can be asked to get us more information, fill this thing out. All of that just seemed good to me. As far as like the federal versus local piece, I have mixed feelings. Like and this is partially why I'm so big on nuclear, just because the
Mm-hmm.
land use question I think is
Yeah.
very underappreciated. And even beyond the frictions of people who are more concerned about CO2 versus like conserving land from, both from kind of like a nominally Democrat perspective. There's
Mm-hmm.
this whole other piece of people who are living inside of these metropolises that are voting for, a grid that's increasingly, that they believe is going to be increasingly just renewables plus batteries. And the tension with the people who live outside of those cities who are like, I don't want these wind turbines
Yeah.
in my
They have to
backyard.
basically like bear the physical cost of that allocation, right? Like that's.
And and it's not a coherent, like these people are not a coalition. If anything, a lot of the rhetoric on the sides of these things is very hostile. And then it
Mhm.
is like, it is very much this like, you know, agency problem where, winners and losers. Like, I don't want the wind farm built in Martha's Vineyard, because that's my backyard. But like, if you're mad about it, building it in whatever, some rural suburb, then like you're a bad person who just thinks we should be using coal.
Sure.
And I think that nuclear kind of is, I'm sure there are some people who believe that. That's obviously a simplification, just trying to,
No.
frame some
Yeah,
sides of
yeah.
the debate. But this is why I think nuclear is such a great solution, just because like kind of another quip I've had for a while is like when people talk about land use, like land use is just a euphemism for ecosystems, like, oh, we're going to
Hmm.
use all of this land. It's like, well, you're going to use all these ecosystems to do this. Like there are
Hmm.
environmental costs there. It's very complex. We don't know what all the consequences of, lining some field with solar panels are.
And you
And,
can't know.
instead
You
we could
can't
just,
know until after, right? Like some things might be obvious, but not everything's going to be obvious. And that's not to post FUD, that's to really ask about quantity and quality trade-offs, right? Like that's the
and,
real discussion.
and I would say that, I would say like the one thing that's become clear to me, just learning more about transmission and the grid, is there's always like it's very common that I'll talk to someone who it comes from an engineering background, in the sense that like this min max like spreadsheet kind of mode,
Hmm.
as opposed to like someone who's engineering these complex systems directly,
Right, right, right.
but like who believes like, well, actually, there's so much land, true, fact check, true, and like a lot of, we don't care about the Sahara Desert or something. We can just build like the biggest solar farm ever. It'll never impact anyone. And then like we'll just transmit it all across which is like, I'm just like, no, you need to look into that more, like what that would mean politically, let alone even just at the raw engineering
Well, raw
level.
engineering, and
That's
then it's like who's going to take care of it. It's like there's a whole operation side to this
yeah,
too that like
there's,
totally gets. It's sort of like it's just like it's field of dreams, right? It's like build it and they will come, and it's like yeah, the
yeah,
transmission lines don't just show up. The guys who clean out
yeah,
the panels don't just show up. Like they have to live somewhere. Like that's a whole. We're talking about a whole outlay
yeah,
here. So I'm there with you on that. Like when Paris and I were talking, we were talking about sort of like how young people approach this issue. And one of the things that I've always valued about you, I brought this up at the beginning, is that you have always been like, we'll figure it out. Right. Like I am way more pessimistic than you based on our
yeah.
interactions. Right. And that's fine. Right. World takes all kinds.
It
Uh,
does, it does.
so talk to me about that. Like, what are you seeing in your age cohort and younger, especially because you live in Austin still, right? Like that's where you're
Yep.
based. Around these discussions of the environment and energy, because I feel like things have been changing in the discourse post Ukraine, but I think we oversimplify how they've been changing. So tell me what you've been seeing.
Yeah, I guess to just start as kind of a caveat, just because I think it is like an important part of the story, is I was, like I think I'm prone to optimism, but I have had my doomer moments. I would say I kind of went
Sure.
through like nothing is possible, like politics is the only solution and it's not gonna work, kind of
Yeah, for
phase.
sure.
Big definitely was a big Bernie bro. Had my hopes and dreams of the political revolution shattered before my very eyes. Maybe it was
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, maybe it
But
was good. Yeah,
I
maybe that was good.
um
You were listening
um
heavily to my old podcast exhaust about why nothing feels
yeah.
possible. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was very tuned into that. And I did, for me, a lot of my kind of reframe actually came from me starting a role as a co-founder of the Barbara J. Berger I Zone at the University of Rochester, which was a incubator targeted at the undergraduate population, very early stage. Just, what's your idea? We had lots of things that were businesses, but also art projects and this like social entrepreneurship, nonprofit work. And that, like, I went from being in a kind of like low agency, everyone very focused on like politics and like, we're one like big election away from everything being good. Spoiler alert, not true.
Yeah.
And
Never true,
even if
actually.
you, yeah,
Never
never
true.
true. Like not just like the Bernie revolution didn't happen, but like even if it did happen, it wouldn't have been what we
Yeah.
all wanted it to be or something like
Yeah,
that.
it's not going to be the Burlington, Vermont Conate of socialized medicine or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so, so just like a reframe on that, but I think that was a very like low agency kind of like alienating worldview that I was occupying, and then I went from being, in this space where I was just surrounded by brilliant young people, a lot of silly ideas, of course, but like great,
Sure.
energizing people trying to do things, figure out, learning things in the world. Also, it's a very international school, so it's like students from everywhere.
Hmm.
Students are coming to me and they're like, I live in this, country in Africa. I received money from the UN to like do like a um like peace studies kind of curriculum to like help to
Hmm.
make like my country more safe. It's just like, okay, that's cool. I'll try to help you the best I can. I don't know anything about that, but like, let's see what
Sure. Let's
resources are
see.
available. Let me connect you to things. And like, this is awesome. So, anyway, that definitely reframed me to be more optimistic because, it's kind of like you do see there are these people who are familiar with problems at like a local level. They're
Hmm.
interested in solving them. They're very smart. They're optimistic, and I think that that was a big reframe for me and how I approach a lot of things in the world. I definitely have my moments where I'm still, you know, 1,000, 10,000 feet in the air, like looking down, and I'm
Sure.
like,
Yeah.
looks kind of bleak, like
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
real. But I would say that in general, I do think there is more optimism on many things. I mean, I think the war in Ukraine and the invasion, very much that was definitely a moment where I was like, oof, humanity just entered a lower equilibrium. Like I don't
Sure.
think there's
Yeah. Yeah.
really like we may be able to reorient, but like that was clearly a blow to the optimist. Like we'll see what happens, but everything became more expensive. Prospects of like really negative outcomes became higher. Like it's just like not good for some like aggregate humanity. But I do think as far as like environmental policy and what like I think there are definitely people who still are extremely antagonistic to natural gas and oil and like their role in creating like modernity and like preserving like the quality of life that we have. Like there are
Hmm.
certainly people who don't get it, but I think people are more open and understanding to like having these conversations because they've experienced like the absence, they've experienced like a higher scarcity. And
Hmm.
then from that, like I think, talking to people about the trade-offs of things and like what is possible and how nuclear can play a role in that, I think people are generally receptive. But I think a lot, the thing that's tough right now, and I think some of the statistics about like declining I forget exactly what the measure is, but like expected lifetime in like the US,
Hmm.
like there's a graph about it just like collapsing. And a lot of that is both like suicides and overdoses and, the overlap
Yeah.
between those two things. There definitely is a lot of despair. And I think some of that is just a culture that is, surrounded with very negative imagery and like activities that are very like low agency. Like I'm not a TikTok user. I don't think it's like the cause of all problems, but to the extent that I've been in like lower agency, like scrolling times of my life, I know it's
Hmm.
bad for you, in the short
Yeah,
run. It
right.
doesn't, I
Like
don't, I
it's
don't need,
yeah, it's bad for you. Like I think we could just say
yeah,
that like and it
yeah.
doesn't even like
I
TikTok.
don't need science to tell me that like it does a specific thing to your brain to know that like
You
when
know it
I'm
does.
in that kind of loop, like when I'm in that kind of loop, it's bad for my mental health and for everything that's like genuinely important and good in my life. And like when I'm in periods where like I have a mission, I have a purpose, I like know
Hmm.
what I have to do the next day, that is like the time that is like most conducive to like broad well-being. So
I
I
think
think, and I think
that's I
there's
think
some
that's
understanding of that.
I think that that's really true. And like, what type of mission matters, right? Like, I think that that's another thing. Like, it's not just any mission will do, like it matters the how and almost the aesthetic of the mission, like what it does to your spirit. I mean, I think that that sort of brought both of us into nuclear through different avenues in different ways. Um, and that I think is sort of like the difference between people who are trying to live in a solution and people who are trying to live in a problem, right? Like
Hmm.
living in a problem is its own mission, right? It's a
Yeah.
permanent crisis and it will never not be a crisis and it will always require exceptional things that you will never achieve. And like that is, I think, that mindset is way more conducive to like doom scroll America.
Totally. And I think something that is good perspective for I think this was extremely valuable for me, even having been in the policy space and asking a lot of these questions and looking at these things. Because I did get dinner with Barbara J. Berger, who's the donor who endowed the program that I built in the University of
Hmm.
Rochester, co-founded, co-built. And she was the president of innovation at Chevron for like
Hmm.
a ton of years. She did like 30 plus years there. And,
Wow.
after being in the space for a bit, I was like asking her questions about different technologies. What do you think of that? What about hydrogen? What about
Hmm.
all these things? Just trying to get a sense of her perspective. And I think that's something which demonstrates this like project level thinking and this like sense of agency of like someone who has like funded things and collaborated with people and like managed projects to like will critical infrastructure into existence is just, like I would say her gut response and reaction is like, it depends on the circumstances. Like, show me like what you're trying to do, what the budget is, like what problem
Yeah.
this is solving
Get
in an extremely
specific.
local capacity, and and then I can tell you whether or not I would like fund the project. Like it's not like this, we're going to have this and this is what the composition is going to be like and it works everywhere and it's the same for everyone. Like, a couple decades of like handling projects will just shake that out of you. So
Hmm.
obviously it's easier to talk about it than it is to have that like perspective hardwired into you. But I think that that's something for people to try to mull on. And I'm sure you can read biographies and things like that would, drive home some of that, or just talk to, people who have built things in your life, and maybe some of them
Yeah.
are like your grandma or your grandpa and you should call them. But like,
Yeah, yeah, for real, for real. No, I think that's really true, right? Like I think people make this mistake, right, where it's sort of like anger and urgency will give you the confidence you need to do the difficult thing, when really it's like prudence and humility like bolster that so much more, right? Like, because they also put you in a place where you're like, okay, I need help with these things, right? Like, you can almost like itemize ways in which you do have agency and ways in which you need help way more
yeah,
coherently than being like, I don't give a shit. I'm going all the way, right? Like the movie version of Andreas Malm's How to Blow Up a Pipeline is coming out,
yeah,
and it's like very clearly to me like that is born of like resentful, terrified thinking with like a total lack of humility, like
yeah.
that
And
that's what that comes out of.
it's not like, it's not endearing to the people who like you need to actually help you do things. Also, just kind of like a caveat side point, this is like falls in the category of like advice that I'm better at giving than actually like
Yeah,
using
that's true for
myself,
most
which
advice I give, by the
yeah,
way, so that's
yeah,
fine.
yeah. Many such cases. But I would say that the is like, for these things where you're like, oh, I don't have the agency in the sense that like I believe this thing needs to get done. I couldn't get it done myself. Um, but actually framing questions or framing asks, being like, find the person who you think can help you and have a very specific request of them is the only way that you get anything done. Like I've had so many conversations with people about job searches and things like that. And they're like, so what are you interested in? Or what do you want to do? And I just like ramble for, 15 minutes answering questions. And they're like, what they want you to do is to go to them and be like, this is what I want to do. Could you connect me to any of these people? That
Mhm.
would be helpful. So just in general, if you can frame things into something that's easier for someone to directly take action on, that's the way you get things done.
Yeah, no, for real. I think that's very true. I mean, I think right now we're sort of entering a weird moment where it's like, I think that there was this paradigm that was building since maybe 2011 and then really had its like apex when Trump got elected. And now it's been like 6 years since that's happened, where it seems like it's like the dust is clearing on a lot of fights, a lot of battlegrounds, and people are like, what have we been doing? Like, what is going on? And I think that's true for energy too. Like, I think for me, like the Inflation Reduction Act Like there's a lot I don't like about it. I'm not going to get into like a whole partisan thing about it here, but I think if you're like the wind, solar plus batteries crowd, if you can't pull it off after this, like you have to do some like serious soul searching. Like it, you know, like that amount of money getting handed out, that amount of leeway, being given to you, and if you and all your arguments about how fast all of this can go,
Yeah.
and if that doesn't pan out, then it's like, okay, what are we really doing?
Yeah, and outside of the permitting stuff, like, like more money isn't going to solve, like, to your point, like more money isn't going to like solve that problem. Like it's kind
Mm-hmm.
of like my joke about this is like, bipartisan, Joe Biden signed and passed the
Mm-hmm.
Inflation Reduction Act, which is basically like the Green New Deal in Washington. Like that's what it looks like once like people get to go through it. So now we're all kind of at the point where we're like, not free market capitalism, but like markets with all of these incentives and things. Now they have to do the work. Like that's really where we're at. Like people understand that like now businesses are going to try to solve these problems to like make money. And as far as policy on that front, it's like that. I don't expect that that's going to be where a lot, like, people may still be amplifying like climate, like apocalyptic kind of rhetoric to try to scare
Mm-hmm.
people into action. But like really where we're at is like now it's like the people putting in the groundwork, those like project based things to like
Yeah, it's
turn this
put up or shut up
vision
time.
into reality. Like that's where we're at. Thought there was, oh, one thing that I just wanted to say as far as like um where we are in like a historical moment. Like no one really knows where things are going from a macro standpoint. Like no one. I'm just putting that out
Mm-hmm.
there. Like I follow enough of these people. Everyone has their ideas.
Sure,
But
yeah.
it seems very possible that we might have interest rates will continue to rise and inflation will be persistent, and that's just like a very different environment for like building things. I
Yeah,
think there
that has
is
a
going to
huge
be a
effect.
whole, and I think there's going to be a whole lot of recontextualizing of like what kind of the long 2010s were, like a lot, whether it's Obama or Trump. I'm a nonpartisan, but regardless, and I'm not conflating the two, they're obviously very different. But
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people had their guy win and exercise a lot of power to realize that vision, and people are very happy with that. And I think it might not be that hard to even look at like what Biden's dealing with, or whoever's president in 2024, and be like, oh, their ability to do things is extremely constrained by these like
Yeah.
external macro factors. And like if we go back and look at the long 2010s, like maybe we should have asked for more, like maybe there was a
Or
great
asked
opportunity there, and
differently.
like everyone, yeah, but like there were opportunities that no longer exist that existed then. And if you look
Mm,
at it, it was like I think a lot of them are missed opportunities. In the same way that I would say like excluding this permitting reform from the IRA was actually like a huge own goal, because like
right.
what's gonna end up happening is this money is flowing in, and I forget what they call it. It's like, I think cost disease socialism or something is
Mm-hmm.
like the like kind of
Yeah.
supply side progressive thing, where they're like, nominally we want to build all this infrastructure, but like without the permitting reform, all we're doing is like giving money to companies to give it to lawyers to fight other lawyers. So
Right,
like the
exactly.
government is like fighting the people we're giving money, and it just like
Yeah.
doesn't result in the things that we want.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think you're right about the macro factors. I mean, there is just over the past like year or so, especially since I started working on Grid Brief, I've gotten so humbled by like how big and complicated all of this is. Like it was not a moment of epistemic victory for me overall. I
Yeah,
was
yeah,
like,
yeah.
I have no idea how this is going to go. And that ended up not being demoralizing, right? Where I was just like, that means there are so many opportunities to learn and learn from other people, right? And to sort of like start to figure out how to rethink all of this stuff, right? Like it's an opportunity, not a defeat. So I think like you're absolutely right. I hope that our conversation has like given people like a different look. At least sharing sort of our stories about this, about how to go forward with this, because I think, we're really about to enter, I just feel like we're about to enter this like phase of new and hopefully more serious debates than what I've seen over the last 6 years.
And I think it is a time of great opportunity. You
Hmm.
know, a lot of it is in the midst of these things being bad or uncertain. You know, so I know that there's a lot of like great people who are currently looking for jobs right now who are extremely talented and
Hmm.
like just need to be able to pay their rent and get back to work. And you know, so if you have if you have money or if you're positioned to like build a company right now, like like I would encourage people to be open-minded. You know, there's a lot of big conservative companies that are like afraid to take any risks, who are not hiring interesting people with like awesome
Hmm.
backgrounds who are extremely competent. I have full conviction that those people are going to find places for themselves and they're going to build awesome things. So that's a big opportunity. I think also both of the political parties are essentially major political parties are in civil war, whether or not they want to talk about it. There's a lot of opportunity there as well. So
For
like I
sure,
think
for
this,
sure.
oddly enough, it's a time where things are costly and some things are
Hmm.
like on their face less possible, but it's also like a time of like great opportunity and like like if you have a vision and you can connect with people and get all the pieces together, there's a lot that can be done.
Well, to finish with a quote from Chairman Mao, chaos is under heaven, conditions are excellent, right? Like that's I think we should think about this as a big opportunity to reframe this debate. And I'm glad that you're on Team Nuclear for that. So everybody, you can find Grant's Twitter and his articles from the Free Up blog and stuff in the show notes. Give him a follow, read his stuff. Grant, thanks so much for coming by. I've been spoiling to do this with you for like a year at least, so I'm glad it finally happened, buddy.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a great time, and yeah, keep up the great work, Nuclear
Yeah,
Barbarian. Let's go.
likewise. So, everybody, remember, stay sharp, stay strong, and stay radiant. We will see you next time.